Between the 15th and 18th centuries, close to 100,000 people were put on trial for witchcraft across Europe. Around 60,000 of them were killed. 80% were women. But here is what almost no history book will tell you. The trial was not where the worst of it happened. The worst happened before the verdict. Inside the walls of prisons and dungeons that most people never saw and that most survivors never lived to describe. This video is not about the famous cases. It is not about Salem or the Spanish Inquisition in broad strokes. It is about what was done to women inside those walls, the specific devices, the specific procedures, the specific cruelties that were considered routine, legal, and justified by the institutions that ordered them. By the end of this video, you will understand that what happened to women in prisons across history was not the exception to civilization. In many cases, it was the product of it. If you're the kind of person who believes history deserves to be told honestly, the full story, not the sanitized version, subscribe now and join us. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because this is a story that should not be buried any longer. Here are 25 punishment practices used on women in prisons throughout history. Number 25. The gibbet cage. In medieval Europe, a woman convicted of blasphemy, adultery, or what the church deemed moral transgression was sometimes locked inside a human-shaped iron cage called a gibbet. The cage was custom-built to fit her body precisely, not loosely, but with intention. The metal pressed against her from every angle. Then the cage was hoisted 15 to 20 feet in the air on a wooden pole at the center of town. She could not sit. She could not extend her arms. She could not shield her face from rain, from freezing wind, from the summer sun. Crowds threw rocks and rotten food. Birds pecked at her through the gaps. Death came from dehydration, starvation, or exposure. It took anywhere from 3 days to over 2 weeks. 16 gibbet cages still survive in British museums. One of them still contains the skull of the woman locked inside it. After she died, her body was left hanging for months, sometimes years, as a warning to every woman in the surrounding villages. Number 24. The Spanish donkey. This device was built with a specific anatomy in mind. It was a sharp, triangular wooden wedge mounted on legs roughly 6 to 7 feet high, with a blade-like edge pointing straight up. The woman was stripped, her hands bound behind her back, and she was forced to straddle the ridge. Her own body weight pressed her downward. Torturers then added iron weights to her ankles to increase the pressure. Some versions had metal spikes running along the top edge. The Jesuits brought this device to North America in 1646. Records from that year document its use on prisoners. Women subjected to it during the Inquisition endured sessions that lasted not hours but days. George Washington himself authorized a 15-minute session on a male soldier in 1775. For women in Inquisition prisons, the same device was used across multiple consecutive days until the prisoner either confessed or stopped breathing. Number 23. Immurement. A woman was placed inside a narrow chamber, sometimes a wall cavity, sometimes a pillar, sometimes a sealed room, and the opening was bricked shut around her. Not metaphorically, literally. Bricklayers built the wall while she stood inside it, sometimes leaving a small hole so food could be passed through, keeping her alive in total darkness for weeks or months before sealing that too. The psychological destruction of being entombed alive while fully conscious broke every single victim. Skeletons have been found inside the walls of medieval buildings across Europe with scratch marks still visible on the stone around them. Those women clawed at the walls until they could not lift their arms anymore. This was not a rare punishment. It was documented practice across medieval Europe, parts of Asia, and the Byzantine Empire, used on women accused of adultery, heresy, or breaking religious vows. Number 22. Starvation in public display cages. Women were locked inside hanging iron cages in public squares and denied all food and water. The cage was designed to be too small to sit in or lie down in. She could only stand, hunched, as the days accumulated. Guards ensured that no passerby offered her anything. Death took between 7 and 14 days. The public watched this unfold. Children walked past on their way to school. Merchants opened their stalls nearby. The dying woman became part of the scenery. In Scotland alone, 3,837 people were accused of witchcraft under the Witchcraft Act. 2/3 were executed. 84% were women. Many of them spent their final days in exactly these cages, dying in full view of the communities that had known them their entire lives. Number 21. Sleep deprivation for the heretic's fork. A small metal device with two sharp prongs at each end, one pressed under the chin, the other pressed into the chest, held in place by a leather strap around the neck. If the woman lowered her head, even slightly, the prongs drove into her throat. If she tried to speak, they pressed deeper into her chin. She could not sleep, could not eat, could not close her mouth. The word "aburo," I recant, was often engraved into the metal. Medical research is clear. The human body begins to deteriorate after 72 hours without sleep. Hallucinations begin. The mind turns on itself. Women in Inquisition prisons were kept in this device for 5, 6, sometimes 7 days. By then, the confession they gave meant nothing. They would have admitted to anything. That was the point. The confession was never about truth. It was about paperwork. Number 20. Forced exposure and public shaming. Across multiple European legal traditions, women convicted of moral crimes, adultery, sexual conduct outside marriage, speaking against a husband or priest, were subjected to public humiliation rituals that were formalized into law. They were paraded through town squares stripped or in torn clothing, forced to carry symbols of their supposed sin, made to stand in the pillory for days where anyone passing could do anything they wished to them. The pillory for women was categorically more dangerous than for men. Men in the pillory faced mockery. Women faced assault. Guards were not required to intervene. What happened to a woman in the pillory was considered part of the punishment. It was written that way deliberately by men who had no reason to write it any other way. Number 19. The knee splitter. 2 blocks of wood, each face studded with sharp iron spikes, placed on either side of a woman's knee. A crank mechanism drew them together simultaneously. The spikes punctured the skin on both sides at the same moment. The kneecap shattered. Tendons snapped. Ligaments were destroyed. This was used during the Inquisition not necessarily to kill, but to permanently mark. Women found innocent after interrogation still carried the damage. There was no surgery. There was no recovery. A woman who walked into that prison on her own legs often left, if she left at all, unable to stand without assistance for the rest of her life. Innocence was not a protection. It was just a different kind of outcome. Number 18. A tortura. A live rat was placed on a woman's bare stomach. A metal bucket was placed over the rat, sealing it against her skin. Fire was then lit on top of the bucket. As the metal heated, the rat panicked, and it did the only thing it could do. It dug through skin, through muscle, through organ. The woman was restrained and could not move. Guards sometimes held the bucket in place for several minutes before lighting the fire, letting the woman hear the rat scratching and clawing in the dark against the metal, letting the fear reach its limit before the real process began. This method appeared across medieval European prisons and resurfaced during political purges in later centuries. It was never considered unusual by the people who administered it. That is, in some ways, the most disturbing fact about it. Number 17. The scavenger's daughter. Invented during the reign of King Henry VIII in England, this iron device worked on the principle opposite to the rack. Instead of pulling the body apart, it compressed everything inward. The woman's head was forced down to her knees. Her arms were crushed against her sides. Iron hoops and screws were tightened until blood was forced from her nose, her ears, and her fingertips from the pressure alone. Ribs cracked under the sustained compression. Breathing became nearly impossible. Some women lost consciousness within minutes. Others were held inside it for hours. Henry VIII ordered the execution of an estimated 57,000 people during his 36-year reign. The scavenger's daughter was standard inventory in his prison system, the same way a modern facility stocks handcuffs. Nobody questioned whether it should exist. It simply existed and was used. Number 16. The iron chair. A chair constructed with between 500 and 1,500 metal spikes, covering every surface. The seat, the back, the armrests, the leg restraints, the footrest. A woman strapped into it was punctured in hundreds of places simultaneously. In some variants, hot coals were placed beneath the chair to heat the spikes while she sat on them. The iron chair did not kill quickly. It was engineered to maintain maximum pain for as long as the interrogator needed. Death came from blood loss, infection, or shock, usually over the course of hours, sometimes days. Women brought to this chair were generally expected to confess before they died in it. Many of them did. Whether what they said was true was a secondary consideration at best. Number 15. The lead sprinkler. A metal container shaped like a small ball on a long handle, filled with boiling water, molten lead, or burning oil. The torturer distributed the liquid through small holes across a woman's body with the precision of someone watering a garden. Each droplet burned through skin on contact. The handle gave the torturer full control over which areas receive the most attention. Eyes, ears, hands. Whatever location the torturer determined would produce the most useful response fastest. This device appears in the inventories of multiple medieval dungeons across France, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula. It was not improvised. It was manufactured. It was purchased. It was maintained. It was a tool of the state, cataloged alongside chairs and candles, and everything else a functioning prison required. Number 14. Forced labor in chain gangs. In the colonial period and well into the 19th century, women in prisons across Europe and the Americas were subjected to labor regimes designed not to rehabilitate, but to destroy. They were chained to other women and forced to work mines, quarries, and plantation fields in conditions that guaranteed physical ruin. Clothing was minimal regardless of weather. Medical care was non-existent. Women who collapsed were beaten back to their feet or left where they fell. In the American South during and after the Reconstruction era, black women were particularly targeted through convict leasing, a system in which prisoners were leased to private companies for profit. The mortality rates inside those camps were so high that some counties stopped reporting them. The women who entered that system were, in most practical terms, already dead. The paperwork just hadn't caught up yet. Number 13. The Judas Cradle. A tall, pyramid-shaped seat with a razor-sharp point at the apex. The woman was stripped, suspended by ropes, and lowered slowly onto the point. Her own body weight determined the rate. The torturers controlled the ropes. They could slow it, accelerate it, lift her slightly, and drop her again. The Spanish Inquisition used this regularly. Internal injuries were almost always fatal. Death could take up to 3 days. In the German city of Eichstätt, 300 suspected witches were executed between 1617 and 1631. Over 90% of them were women. Many of them encountered the Judas Cradle during the interrogation phase. Before any verdict had been rendered, before any formal condemnation had been issued, torture was not the consequence of a guilty verdict. In most cases, it preceded one. Number 12. Forced institutionalization and medicalization. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, a new kind of prison emerged, one with cleaner walls and doctors in white coats. Women who challenged social norms, who refused marriages, who expressed sexuality outside of approved contexts, who exhibited what was labeled hysteria, were committed to psychiatric institutions under diagnoses that would today be recognized as fabrications. Inside those institutions, they were subjected to procedures called treatments. Ice baths sustained for hours, restraint in straitjackets for days, surgical removal of parts of their reproductive anatomy on the theory that those organs caused mental instability. Women committed by husbands or fathers had almost no legal recourse. They had committed no crime. They had no sentence. There was no release date. Some of them died inside those walls decades later, having never left. Never been charged, never been tried. The institution was the punishment, and the punishment. Words had no end. Number 11. The choke pear. A metal device, pear-shaped, inserted into a woman's mouth. When the torturer turned the screw at the top, the device expanded outward, forcing the jaw open beyond its natural range. versions fitted with internal blades cut into the roof of the mouth and the throat as they opened. Women accused of lying, witchcraft, or what the church called illicit relationships were subjected to this. Survivors were permanently disfigured. The structural damage to the jaw made eating solid food impossible for the rest of their lives. The device accomplished something beyond physical harm. It ensured that even if a woman survived, she would spend the remainder of her existence as a visible testament to what happened to women who said the wrong things to the wrong people at the wrong moment. Number 10. Branding. Across European and American legal history, women convicted of various crimes, theft, adultery, prostitution, vagrancy, were branded with hot irons on their faces, hands, or chests. The brand was a letter corresponding to the crime. T for thief, A for adulteress. The mark was intended to follow her for the rest of her life, making her recognizable, unemployable, and permanently excluded from respectable society. In colonial America, branding was written directly into law. It was applied in public, in front of crowds, as a ritual of humiliation as much as punishment. The brand ensured that even after a woman left prison, the prison never truly left her. Every stranger who saw her face could read what had been decided about her. She had no appeal. The iron had already spoken. Number 9. Judicial flogging. Judicial flogging of women in prison was practiced across the British Empire, in American penitentiaries, and across European colonial territories well into the 20th century. In British colonial territories, women could be sentenced to whipping for crimes as minor as theft. The strokes were administered with canes or leather straps to the back, the legs, or the feet. In American reformatories of the late 19th century, institutions specifically built for women, flogging was a standard disciplinary tool used on inmates for infractions like speaking out of turn, refusing work assignments, or attempting to communicate with other prisoners. Many of the women subjected to this were not there for violent crimes. They were there for being poor, for being black, for having been born into circumstances that the law had decided made them criminal by nature rather than by choice. Number 8. The breast ripper. An iron tool with 4 heated claws, used from the 13th century through the 17th. It was designed exclusively for the female body. The device was heated until it glowed, pressed against the body, and pulled away. Women accused of adultery, pregnancy outside of marriage, or what the church categorized as erotic transgression were the primary targets. A wall-mounted version, sometimes called the iron spider, was also used, in which the woman was pulled away from a fixed device and her own body weight caused the tearing. Historical records suggest Saint Agatha of Sicily suffered this exact procedure before her execution in the 3rd century. The damage was catastrophic and almost always fatal within hours. The church that ordered it called itself an institution of mercy. That contradiction was never resolved. It was never even acknowledged. Number 7. Prolonged solitary confinement in total darkness. Across the history of women's prisons, from medieval dungeons to 19th century penitentiaries to 20th century institutions, prolonged solitary confinement in complete darkness was a formal punishment. Women were placed in cells with no light source, no human contact, no sound, no ability to track the passage of time, for periods ranging from weeks to months. Modern neuroscience has established that the human brain begins to generate hallucinations within days of sensory deprivation. The mind does not simply wait in darkness. It turns on itself. Women subjected to extended isolation emerged with conditions that their captors then used as evidence of the very mental instability that had supposedly justified the confinement. It was a system that manufactured the diagnosis it claimed to treat, and it did so with complete institutional confidence. Number 6. Rhinotomy. In ancient Egypt and the Byzantine Empire, women convicted of adultery had their noses surgically removed. The procedure was called rhinotomy. The wound left a permanent, visible disfigurement that communicated the accusation to every person who saw her face for the rest of her life. She could not hide it. She could not explain it away. She wore the verdict in her bones. Men convicted of the same crime in the same legal systems received a fine. sometimes a beating. The double standard was not incidental to the law. It was written into it deliberate and considered by men who believed that a woman's body was an appropriate surface on which to publish her failures, and that her face was an appropriate place for the record to be kept. Number 5. Crocodile shears. A metal instrument shaped like oversized pliers, with the interior surfaces lined with sharp teeth, resembling a crocodile's jaw. The shears were heated until red and then clamped onto fingers, toes, or other extremities. One squeeze removed the appendage entirely burned and crushed at the same moment. This was used on women accused of treason or poisoning, and court records from European kingdoms between the 13th and 17th centuries document its application across multiple countries. The records that survive are largely administrative. They list the procedure, the date, the name of the prisoner. They do not describe the room. They do not say how long it took. They do not record who was present or what they said afterward. The bureaucracy of cruelty has always been more interested in paperwork than in what the paperwork describes. Number 4. Flaying. The skin was peeled from a woman's body while she remained alive and fully conscious. Beginning at the hands or feet, the torturer used a sharp blade to separate skin from the muscle beneath, working inward toward the torso. The process took 4 to 6 hours when performed by someone who knew what they were doing. In some cultural traditions, the removed skin was displayed publicly afterward as a warning. This was practiced in ancient Assyria, in medieval Europe, and in parts of imperial China. Skilled executioners applied salt to the exposed tissue not out of additional cruelty, but to prevent the body from going into shock, because shock would have ended the woman's consciousness, and consciousness was the point. She was meant to feel every moment of it. The body's own survival instinct was turned into a mechanism of prolonged suffering. Number 3. Burning at the stake. Between 1450 and 1750, tens of thousands of women were burned alive at the stake across Europe following conviction on charges of witchcraft. The sentence was public. The execution was public. The death was designed as spectacle, and crowds gathered to watch it. Death by fire is not fast. At low heat, with wet wood, it could take 45 minutes or longer. The smoke reached the lungs before the flames reached the body, and loss of consciousness from smoke inhalation was not guaranteed. Women who were shown mercy were strangled before the fire was lit. Women for whom no mercy was offered experienced every second of what followed. In the Würzburg witch trials alone, which ran from 1626 to 1631, approximately 900 people were executed. The majority were women. The majority burned. Number 2. The pear of anguish. A metal instrument shaped like a pear, constructed of 4 iron leaves connected at a central screw. It was inserted into the body, and then the screw was turned. The leaves spread apart inside, tearing everything they contacted as they opened. The damage was catastrophic. Death came from hemorrhage or infection within hours to days. No medical care was provided. No mercy was shown after the device was removed. This instrument was used on women accused of witchcraft, of illicit sexuality, of what the Inquisition called union with the devil. It was not improvised in a moment of rage. It was manufactured with precision. It was used systematically across multiple countries and multiple centuries. Human beings designed it, built it, refined it across generations, and used it on women whose primary crime was being accused by someone who wanted them gone. Number 1. Judicial torture as the standard pretrial process. For much of European legal history, torture was not a punishment that followed a guilty verdict. It was the mechanism through which the verdict was obtained. Women accused of any serious crime, witchcraft, heresy, murder, adultery, were routinely subjected to whatever methods the local legal code permitted before any judgment was rendered. The confession extracted under that torture then became the primary evidence used against them at trial. This was not a failure of the system. It was the system. Across the Spanish Inquisition, the German witch trials, the French heresy tribunals, and the English common law courts, torture of the accused was considered a legitimate and often mandatory step in the legal process. Women entered that process with no meaningful right to silence, No protection against self-incrimination, no advocate, no appeal. They were guilty because they were accused. The torture was simply the paperwork. Nearly 100,000 people were tried for witchcraft across Europe. Up to 60,000 were killed. 80% were women. For many of them, everything on this list was not a sequence of separate horrors happening to different people in different centuries. It was the routine experience of a single prison stay in a single city in a single year, administered by officials who believed, without question, that they were doing their jobs correctly. History will not forget what happened to those women. That is the least it owes them.